Blaise Mishtal, our Director of National Security, and we're here today with a topic and a panel that, unlike me, needs no introduction. It's been a tumultuous and perhaps, dare I even say, momentous week in the Middle East, starting last Tuesday with President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, followed by Iranian strikes on Israel and Israeli retaliation, followed by an election in Iraq over the weekend, and culminating today in the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem and the skirmishes and violence that we've already seen resulting from that this morning. So to discuss all of that in the context of U.S. strategic interests and what the United States should be doing, we're very pleased to have with us the co-chairs of our task force on managing disorder in the Middle East, Jake Sullivan, formerly the National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, Director of Policy Planning at the State Department, and now with Yale Law School and the Carnegie Endowment, as well as Ambassador Eric Edelman, U.S. Ambassador to Turkey and formerly Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and now with Johns Hopkins and so many other institutions that I can't ever remember all of them. They are, along with the rest of our task force, the authors of a paper we're releasing today called U.S. Policy Towards Iran, Strategic Options, which builds on an earlier paper that we did trying to think about what U.S. strategic interests in the Middle East are, what U.S. objectives should be. The answer there was sustainable stability at a sustainable cost. And so our new paper thinks about how that might be achieved, specifically vis-a-vis Iran, and offers some options for doing that. So let's dive right in. With this, has anything in terms of U.S. strategic interests changed in the Middle East, given recent events? Mosul and Raqqa have been taken. The Islamic State is relegated to a few ever-shrinking pockets along the Euphrates Valley. The nuclear deal with Iran, the disastrous nuclear deal with Iran, as President Trump's put it, has been dealt with. Can the U.S. sort of wash its hands of the Middle East now?
Okay. Well, I'll go first. So, I don't think anything has changed in terms of our interests in the region. I think the situation in the region has shifted a bit as a result of everything, and it's only Monday, so I mean, I haven't even checked the president's Twitter account this morning. So, I think there's like a plus minus balance sheet here. I think our relations with our European allies in terms of trying to manage stability in the region have clearly taken a turn for the worse, and that will be the case for some period of time as the sanctions issues post-withdrawal get sorted out. In the Middle East itself, I think the steps the president has taken have been predictably greeted with disapproval by the Supreme Leader and by President Rouhani, but very positively by some of our other allies in the region, Israel, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, et cetera. I think it's quite striking that the Iranian reaction, the initial reaction, has been essentially to stay in the deal. And I think they're taking that position because they're hoping that the Europeans can mitigate some of the worst consequences for them of the sanctions, because the Iranian economy is in such desperate trouble. My Johns Hopkins colleague, Steve Hanke, who once upon a time put together a number of currency boards that helped save a couple of Latin American economies, has said that he compares the Iranian economy to the Venezuelan economy. He says they're both in a death spiral. And whether that's true or not, we'll find out. But the Iranians clearly have an interest in trying to mitigate the worst that might happen to them economically. So at least for a period of time, I don't think you're going to see breakout or steps in that direction by Iran on the nuclear side. I think ISIS is still going to be a challenge for us, and I think the temptation to withdraw from the region, which is great, including for many of us who've spent lots of our professional lives working in it, I think is still going to be directed to some degree by what happens with Iran, but also the ongoing fight with ISIS. It's not over. There still are pockets of ISIS fighters, as you were saying, in the Euphrates Valley. And there are others waiting to try and pick up the pieces, notably including the remnants of al-Qaeda. So those factors, I think, will tend to keep us tied to the region. And there's one other, which is the sharpening conflict between Israel and Iran. In going through the events of last week, the one thing you didn't mention was the Israeli strike on a number of sites in Syria that are manned by IRGC forces. And that's a constant reminder that the potential for a conflict between Israel and Iran, which would inevitably, I believe, draw the United States back into the region, is ever present and perhaps growing.
So picking up on that, Jake, let me ask you whether you see the Iranian strike just a day or so after President Trump's decision as a coincidence in timing or a reaction to the decision to withdraw from JCPOA, and what it might say about what U.S. interests in Syria should be defined as, particularly vis-a-vis Iran.
So I don't think the strike was entirely and comprehensively a response to the president's decision on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I think the Iranians had been waiting to determine their reaction to what had been a series of Israeli strikes on Iranian and Iranian proxy positions in Syria. But I think the timing was directly connected to the president's announcement on the Iran deal. They decided to move forward with a plan that they had probably cooked up before the announcement, but chose their moment to do so in the immediate aftermath of the announcement. What does the target set they chose tell us? It tells us that they're not looking to start a war with Israel right now. They tried to strike places that wouldn't lead to significant loss of life or escalation, but with enough missiles fired that they could turn around to their people and say we had a meaningful response to Israeli aggression. And the Israelis, for their part, who responded quite decisively in the wake of that, I think are not looking to start a war with Iran either. But you now have a tinderbox because you've got two sides that both want to use military force against one another, but under a certain ceiling so that all hell doesn't break loose. That is a recipe for mistake, miscalculation, and the possibility for things spinning out of control, which I think we could see. And to your earlier question, I would just say that there has been a growing narrative leading up to and following the president's decision on the JCPOA that somehow the existence of this deal was the proximate cause of Iranian malign behavior in the region, that it was what unleashed Iran upon the Middle East. And I would just say the president's decision to withdraw from the deal is not going to put Iran back in a box in the region, because Iran was active and aggressive in multiple theaters and countries across the region before the JCPOA. It was active in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Bahrain, before the JCPOA was even a glint in the imagination of the Obama administration, which I served in, during the JCPOA, and it will be true after the JCPOA. And I think we have to be clear-eyed about that and not buy into the rhetoric that somehow walking away from the deal now solves our problems with Iran vis-a-vis the region. And as far as ISIS is concerned, others have heard me say this before, and we noted this in our first report. The basic conditions that produced al-Qaeda in Iraq in the first place, and then produced its successor, ISIS, still exist and could generate ISIS's successor, the son of ISIS or the cousin of ISIS. Those are all still very present. And my concern is that the U.S. in both Iraq and Syria doesn't seem to have a particular game plan for how to deal either with that or with Iran's influence in those two countries. And so in that sense, there's a big gap between the muscularity of the president's rhetoric when it comes to Iran and ISIS, and then his actual desire to do anything about it in the region. And I think that gap is now only going to become more apparent and more exposed in the wake of his decision, in my view, deeply mistaken decision to withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Sure. Can I just pick up on something that Jake said, because I think it's relevant to the report we just released, because I agree with most of what Jake just said. Putting aside differences about the JCPOA itself, which I suspect Jake and I do disagree on, I think we all agree, and I think the panel of people we had all agreed, that whatever position you take on that, the United States needs to have some kind of strategy for dealing with Iran more broadly in the region. And what the report attempts to do is to set out what alternate strategies might look like in which a decision to withdraw could have been embedded. I agree very much with Jake, both in the president's speech last October, in which he decertified the agreement, and then in his remarks on Tuesday. I think one looks in vain for any suggestion of, there's a lot of rhetoric about we're going to stop Iran, we're going to push back against Iran, but there's absolutely no discussion of the ways and means by which that's going to be done. And many other things the president has said or steps that the administration has taken have actually made it more difficult, I think, to put such a strategy in place. And so I think part of the purpose of the report is to at least provide people with a framework for thinking about how one might go about putting a strategy together, what different alternatives there might be, and what you might take from each of these alternatives, all of which are, in some sense, archetypes, to put together maybe a hybrid strategy.
So before we delve into those options, maybe we could talk a little bit about what the objective is. Jake, you said sort of putting Iran back in its box. But what exactly should that box be, and what are the sort of the boundaries of the malign behaviors that we're concerned with versus what we can tolerate? I think we debated this a bit in our task force, but the land corridor was an issue that sort of seized everybody's imagination. Last summer, that Iran might possibly have this stretch of land that it controls going from Tehran through Baghdad into Syria, perhaps all the way to the Mediterranean. And we sort of gone back and forth. Would that really be a major geostrategic shift in its ability to project power or not? Now we have Iran striking directly at Israel. Does that change? So what are the contours of the box that we're trying to put Iran back in?
Well, I use that phrase more to try to characterize what the Trump administration is doing than my own personal view, which is slightly different. I mean, Eric, in characterizing the task force report, I think is exactly right. What we tried to do is give some shape to what the significant alternative strategies might look like. And they range from a very aggressive rollback option to something more balanced that looks like an uneasy modus vivendi between the Sunni states in the region and Iran, more based on a balance of power concept. My own view is that Iran is not going anywhere. They exist in the region. They are an actor in the region. And to wish away all Iranian influence everywhere across the region, I think, is to start from a strategic premise that will never lead you to an effective result. And so we have to think about and have a serious conversation about what does an outcome actually look like that constrains and curbs the worst aspects of Iranian behavior, but also recognizes that they are going to be a player in this region, as all of the other significant actors are going to be players in this region, Egypt and Turkey, the other Sunni states, et cetera. And here, I think the task force was united in wanting to have a clear, systematic laydown of what's on offer in terms of options, because everybody goes around talking about, well, we've got to push back on Iran and stop their malign activity in the region. But as Eric said, nobody really says what that actually means. Nobody spells it out in black and white. It says, here are the tools you'd have to use to accomplish that. And here are the outcomes you might think about if you were using those tools. So the report tries to do that. Now, I think we have a difference of opinion about among the task force, including among the chairs of the task force, about what the best way to go about that is and what the best objectives are. My own personal view is that the order of the day should be de-escalation rather than escalation. But I think the administration is heading down an escalatory path here. And the question for me, having walked away from the deal without a clear strategy in mind, is where does this all lead? And I think that they owe a better answer to the American people than they have provided so far on that question.
So do you want to sketch out the de-escalatory modus vivendi option?
Well, my basic view is that if you start from the premise that Iran isn't going anywhere in the region, that they are going to be an actor and they are going to have interests beyond their borders the way that every other country in the region has interests beyond their borders. then the issue becomes, how do you produce an outcome in which you arrive at an uneasy, de-escalated modus vivendi between Saudi Arabia and the other Sunni states on the one hand and Iran on the other hand? What would that take? And from my perspective, it does require active, engaged American presence, diplomacy, including force posture. It does require us to raise the costs on Iran for some of their behavior in terms of the sponsorship of terrorism, their co-authorship of the massive humanitarian tragedy that is the Syrian crisis. And it does require that we raise the confidence of our Sunni partners by continuing to deepen our partnerships with them. But that should be in service of an outcome in which ultimately Saudi Arabia and the other Sunni states, whether in direct dialogue or more through signaling, work out with the Iranians an understanding about how they can coexist in the region over time. Now, I'm not naive enough to think this is going to happen immediately, but I think that has to be the goal. And then the United States should be executing strategies in service of that goal rather than say, it's just going to be a all-out, punitive, crush them, try to generate regime change type of strategy that you see flickers and hints of coming out of this administration, which I ultimately think would not serve long-term regional stability or the interest of sustainable security at sustainable cost, as our original report suggested.
So, not to paint the co-chairs into specific boxes, but Pastor Edelman, would you like to discuss some of the other options that we came up with?
Well, I guess for me, the other two options that we discussed, as Jake suggested in his comments, were on the, I'm not sure what the left-right orientation of this is, but on the right margin would be rollback, which, depending on how it was executed, might even provoke something like the regime change option Jake was talking about. And in between, something I think we called containment, which in some ways would have elements, I think, really of both the rollback and the balance of power options in it, but it would be a more robust, I think, effort to try and use more some military and other tools to kind of contain Iranian activity and stop some of what we've seen going on in the region. For me, the beginning of wisdom on all this is to accept the fact that we are dealing with a revolutionary regime here that has been the source of the turmoil, or not the only source, but a major source of the turmoil in the region going back to the revolution itself in 1979. I think our own interest, and I think the interest of most of the states in the region, is that Iran desist from trying to spread the revolution by forcible means, mostly through the use of proxies, but now in Syria directly through the use of Iranian forces in the form of the IRGC. I think one could argue that Hezbollah, in some sense, is an emanation of the IRGC, since it was set up in the Bekaa Valley in 1982 and 83 by the IRGC, but it does have its own Lebanese particular characteristics. How we get them to do that, I think, is a question of different kinds of means that we might use, including economic pressures, although it bears mentioning that Iran is already the most heavily sanctioned country in the world, including North Korea. How much more of that we can do remains to be seen. I think there is still more in that bucket that could be done. I think it requires, from my point of view, a continuing presence in Syria at some level for some time, and certainly in Iraq as well. And I don't know whether that's going to be a price that's too high for this administration or any other administration to pay. But I would say, in my view, if there's any hope of getting to the option that Jake was describing of some kind of modus vivendi, I think you've got to go through some of these other two options to get there.
It's interesting. I was going to make this point before Eric just did. In the immediate term, I I would say what Eric is describing and what I'm describing converge around a set of options, even as maybe the long-term objective diverges. So more economic pressure on Iran, which, by the way, I think we could have pursued while maintaining the JCPOA, and I think walking away from the JCPOA is going to make it harder to rally the world, including the Europeans, who had said they were prepared to step up to do more on this front if we kept the deal in place. Interdictions of Iranian weapon shipments across the region, various forms of pressure on the irregular proxy groups from Hezbollah and Hamas to the Houthis in Yemen, who are threatening our partners in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. In order to get to an uneasy balance of power, a modus vivendi, I do think, as I said in my remarks, you have to raise the costs on Iran in the near term, because the strategy they're currently pursuing, they believe, is working. And it is a destabilizing strategy, one that leaves the region worse off, our partners worse off, and us worse off. So we do have to do something about that. My argument just is, as we increase the means to resist, counter, and push back on Iranian activity in the region, we should have a credible, sensible, and sustainable endgame in mind that is not maximalist in all of its dimensions.
So, if to get to the point where we could have a modus vivendi of some kind, balance of power in the region that Iran would respect, you have to bet that all these pressures, when they finally work their way through, change the regime's behavior in the kind of way that we saw happen in the Soviet context. And I recognize Iran is not the Soviet Union. I'm not trying to make that analogy, but it was impossible for the United States to negotiate real serious arms control with the Soviet Union until the Soviet Union accepted peaceful coexistence, and that it was not going to be able to export the Soviet revolution by force abroad. And I don't know whether this revolutionary regime, can come to that point or not. I mean, I think it's not a knowable question. We'll only know from, what transpires, whether that is realizable, objective or not.
So, last question before turning it over to the audience. There's been talk, including from French President Emmanuel Macron, of the possibility of a new, bigger deal that takes all of the issues and packages them together, right? Dealing with the nuclear issue, ballistic missiles, Iran's presence in Syria. So does withdrawal from the JCPOA sort of open the door for some sort of new grand bargain? Does it make it easier for to deal with Iran's malign behavior, or does it complicate matters?
Well, this is the strange situation we find ourselves in. The two State Department officials gave a background briefing following the deal last week, and if you read the transcript of it, it's clear they don't have an answer to that question, even the beginnings of an answer to that question. You have a president who referred to the possibility of a new deal at the end of his remarks, but his role in this, from his perspective, is basically complete because he's gotten rid of Barack Obama's horrible deal. And so now it kind of goes over to his team, and I don't think John Bolton is the least bit interested in a grand bargain with Iran. I think he's interested in testing whether something closer to the maximum pressure strategy can really put the hurt on Iran, even up to the point of cracking the regime. So I'm pretty skeptical that the thrust or direction of U.S. policy in the weeks and months ahead is going to be to try to set up some kind of new negotiation. On the flip side, it's hard for me to see how the Iranians, in the weeks and months ahead, turn around and say, okay, let's all sit down and negotiate some grand bargain where we satisfy all of your quite maximalist demands on everything from missiles to nukes to regional behavior, whatever Macron would like. So I don't rule out the possibility, because the situation is fluid and dynamic and deeply unpredictable, but I find it highly unlikely that we are now on a track towards a new negotiation involving the whole suite of issues around Iran. I think we are at the beginning of a long-term testing phase of the proposition that pressure and growing pressure can have a really significant impact on Iranian behavior.
And change the calculus.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. With that, let me turn it over to the audience. Please be sure to introduce yourself and include a question in your remarks. We have a microphone, please, coming up. Please wait for that.
Thank you for this panel. My name is Rachel Oswald, reporter with Congressional Quarterly. My question involves conjecture, so I do apologize for that. But what happens if, in the imposition of sanctions...
We're former government officials. All we do is conjecture, okay. So please.
I know it makes some people kind of uncomfortable when I ask conjecture questions. But so if major importers of Iranian oil like China and India decide to continue importing Iranian oil, perhaps constructing vehicles that allow them to avoid contact with the U.S. financial system, what potential cascading effects could that have both on Europe and the potential for about European decisions about how they're going to approach U.S. secondary sanctions, and also the future of the U.S. financial system if people decide that there are ways for them to avoid U.S. financial sanctions?
It's a really important question, and I don't think the administration has entirely thought this strategy through. Number one, China has already experimented with creating vehicles that insulate transactions from U.S. financial sanctions. They did it with the Bank of Kunlun during the last round. Number two, the Trump administration and President Trump himself, through this ZTE announcement recently, has shown that he's not particularly interested in loading up the demand set with the Chinese too much. He wants to get some trade concessions from them, and if he has to give up a national security issue like ZTE to get them, it appears that he will do it. Iranian oil, I think, is going to fall below ZTE on the priority list for him, so I have a hard time believing that the United States is going to respond to the Chinese setting up these alternative vehicles by sanctioning the Central Bank of China or something like that. So I don't think we're in a particularly strong position when it comes to China or India or other actors. Europe is a different case. I think European banks and European companies are likely to come into compliance with the sanctions because they're just not going to want to take the risk. And I don't see European countries taking the dramatic measures they would have to take in order to insulate those companies. It's possible. They're talking about it. They'll probably explore it. But if I had to go ahead and conjecture, I would say in all likelihood, they'll find themselves the big losers in this whole thing, which will put more strain on the transatlantic relationship going forward.
I largely agree with what Jake said. I mean, I think on the European side, you do see some huffing and puffing and arguments that Europe should not be a doormat and we can't let the Americans do this to us and we've got to figure out. But I think in the end of the day, the interpenetration of the two economies is just too great to make it likely that they will do much more than Jake suggested. But they won't be happy. And so there'll be scar tissue on the transatlantic relationship that will take some time to work out, unless, as Jake said, the situation here is very fluid, and for me, the wild card is the Iranian economy and how bad it is, and what the repercussions of that will be for the regime itself as it negotiates with the Europeans, because the Europeans have to somehow propitiate the Iranians a little bit without not being in compliance with the sanctions, and so that's going to be the needle they're going to try and thread.
And just on your point, your question about the longer-term trajectory of the U.S. sanctions tool writ large, I think this is a really important question because American sanctions work best when they are some combination of coercion and cooperation. Coercion in that we're holding the hammer out there, but cooperation because we actually work with other countries to come up with something that they can reasonably comply with. That's the story of the Iran sanctions from 2010 to 2015. What supporters of a really strong sanctions approach argue now is we just have to go around and tell everybody you either trade with Iran or you trade with us, and they'll have no choice. I think that can work for Europe in the near term, but I think it will increase the intensity of the desire of the rest of the world to figure out ways to reduce the impact of U.S. sanctions over the long term. That'll take a while, but the my way or the highway approach in general, I think, undermines the sustainable efficacy of what has become a really important American national security tool. So I believe we should be careful in being too aggressive in how we deploy it.
Not to belabor the point, but because it is so important, I think it's worth pausing on for a second. So I think some of the best evidence for what Jake and I are both saying about European behavior is the fact that one of the constant complaints since 2015 from the Iranian side is that the West has not been, in fact, honoring the deal, quote unquote, because European countries are not investing and trading with Iran at sufficient levels despite the lifting of all the sanctions, which led Secretary Kerry to go around Europe in his last year, jawboning the Europeans to actually put more money in. But the fear already existed before we got out of the deal that they might run afoul of still existing legislation on the books, that European companies have been very, very wary of getting into the Iranian market. Now they're going to be even more concerned.
All right, we have time for one more question. Yes, gentleman in the front row.
Thank you very much, Alexander Kravitz from Insight. I wanted to pick up on the last comment that Ambassador Edelman said, that it's not knowable whether one could ultimately work out a peaceful coexistence scenario with Iran. And I'm wondering, maybe to put Jake on the spot, whether you could comment on that. Whether that had been, or whether that was an assumption in your thinking. I mean, whether, how that could be reached or not. And a second question, how may the withdrawal play out on the Qatar-Saudi RIF and the government formation in Iraq following the elections on Sunday?
I think the diversity of opinion in the Obama administration about what the knock-on effects of the nuclear deal would be. I mean, I've been making the case for years now, going all the way back to the interim deal in 2013, that this was an arms control agreement. This was an agreement about Iran's nuclear weapons program and stopping that program from moving forward and blocking Iran's path to get a bomb. I have never believed that doing the nuclear deal was going to be an avenue to some kind of grand rapprochement with Iran. And I frankly probably wouldn't even use the phrase peaceful coexistence to describe the long-term objective I'm arguing for. I'd say uneasy balance of power that is going to involve probably ongoing low-intensity conflict of some sort, but de-escalated significantly from where we are right now, where you gain greater stability and security over time, but you don't fundamentally alter the adversarial nature of the relationships in the region. So I don't think that what I'm advocating for is that Iran is going to become friendly and integrated into the global community and see things the same way we do. I'm arguing that by raising the costs on their regional activity, by raising the confidence of our regional partners, but also by creating a pathway to de-escalation on all sides, we can produce an outcome that is more in the interest of both regional security and America's national security over time. I agree with Eric. It's unknowable whether that is possible. My argument is pointing in that direction rather than the self-fulfilling prophecy of saying we're just going to have an ever-escalating cycle of conflict with Iran that may eventually lead to outright war, I think is a better, more sustainable approach for the United States. It doesn't mean you don't have to be hard-headed about it and think about how you change incentives and disincentives. But that's my take and how I don't see it quite the way that your question suggested. With respect to the rift between Saudi and the UAE and some of the other Gulf states and Qatar, I'm somewhat skeptical that the JCPOA decision is going to have a major impact on that. I think both the root of that and the ultimate solution to that lie quite outside the overall question of Iran. I mean, there is embedded in the objection of the Saudis and the Emiratis a critique of Qatari behavior that they are too close to Iran, but I don't think the existence or lack of existence of the Iran nuclear deal is going to have a major impact on that. I think, first of all, it's going to take a long time for that to get resolved. And secondly, the way its path to resolution lies on a quite distinct track from what's going on with the nuclear file in Iran.
On Iraq, well, I'll comment briefly on that, and then there's one point that Jake raised I wanted to touch on before we go to the next panel, which has to do with arms control and I think the frailty of the Obama administration's diplomacy in this regard and why it's been so easy to overturn this agreement. On Iraq, look, the returns are all fragmentary right now. We don't really know what's going on. We were having a discussion earlier. My view is the good news about this election is that all of the parties seem to have felt the need to recruit cross-sectarian slates of candidates. That's all to the good. The returns we've seen so far seem to suggest that the Sadrists and Al-Amari's group may be the top two vote getters, which is not so good. And the worst thing from my point of view is the very large drop in turnout, which suggests that many Iraqis are giving up on the political system. How much this will strengthen or weaken Iran's influence is, I think, a little hard to say at this point. But I agree with what Jake said earlier. Look, Iran is always going to have influence in Iraq. That's a reality. We're not going to be able to eliminate Iran's influence. The question will be, can we maintain a sufficient position in Iraq to counterbalance it? Because I think there will be a lot of Iraqis who are going to want a counterbalance to Iranian influence, and I think that is a role we can play. Jake talked about the JCPOA as an arms control agreement, and he and I think, disagree about the agreement itself and its merits. All arms control agreements have to be judged on the balance of merits and their pluses and minuses, because all arms control agreements are a result of a negotiation in which all sorts of trade-offs get made. Having spent a lot of my misspent youth as a diplomat working on arms control with the Soviet Union and Russia, the frailty, I think, of President Obama's approach, and I actually testified to this in front of the Armed Services Committee in August of 2015, in which I was the only member of the panel, which was Mike Hayden, Richard Haas, and Nick Burns, who actually advocated that the senators vote against the agreement. They never got the opportunity to do that because of the filibuster that prevented a vote on the Senate floor. But Federalist 75 says the word of the United States is sufficiently important that it ought not be entrusted to just one man, i.e. the president. And previous arms control agreements have all been submitted, not all, but most have been submitted to the Senate for a vote as binding treaties. The SALT agreement was actually an executive agreement, but it also was subjected to a vote by both houses of the Congress. In this instance, the president chose to go ahead with an executive agreement that was underwater in public opinion polls, and now still is, according to the Pew poll, after having gone up a little bit, and clearly did not have the support of the House or the Senate. And in the Senate, although I think supporters of the agreement like to say, well, we couldn't ever get anything because the Republicans were just so obdurate, and there's certainly truth in that. It is also the case that the Senate Minority Leader, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee all declared themselves against this agreement. And I think the reason why essentially President Trump was able to just dispense with this is because of that, I think, underlying weakness in the approach President Obama took to negotiating this agreement. All right, Jake, I don't want to put Jake on the spot, but I want to give him an opportunity to respond to that.
I guess I would say just a couple things in response. The first is that previous presidents have a track record of pulling out of arms control agreements that were duly ratified by the Senate, so there's nothing to stop, there would have been nothing to stop Donald Trump from doing so, even if this had gone through. Secondly, the Senate and the House actually did pass the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, where they collectively agreed on how the Congress would go about looking at this deal. And that was the Republicans essentially saying, we are going to let this happen because, they created.
It was Bob Corker saying that, but yes.
But getting the votes for it,
yeah.
Getting the votes for it through bicameralism and presentment that said we are going to authorize the president to enter into this agreement and only take it away from him if we can get a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate to disapprove of it. So I actually think there was a system set up that brought the Republicans along in a minimal way, but not quite as extreme as what Eric said. And then finally, one of my experiences with treaties, and I teach about treaties, and I completely agree with you that it's a terrible thing that our constitutional system doesn't allow for the ratification of treaties anymore. But one of my experiences in the Obama administration was watching Bob Dole on the floor of the U.S. Senate trying to get the Disabilities Treaty ratified. This is a treaty that imposed zero obligations on the United States and made the rest of the world come up to ADA standards. And you couldn't get 67 votes for that. The idea that we get 67 votes for basically any serious treaty that was not just the extension of something like New START, but a new thing. If that's the bar we need to meet, then we're not going to be entering into international agreements of any
It will be very
quality in the future.
It will be very interesting if Secretary Pompeo and President Trump return from Singapore on June 12th with an agreement to end the war, which, as far as I can tell, will have to be a treaty. And whether or not that can get ratified or not, we'll see.
Well, it's interesting because I can see a Republican president being able to get a treaty done. I just can't really see a Democratic president being able to get a treaty done. But Democratic presidents have to do international deals as well as Republicans, or we're not going to be anywhere. So it will be interesting to see.
Well, perhaps we'll have to have you back after June 12th to debate the future of U.S. treaties. But in the meantime, thank you very much to Eric Edelman and Jake Sullivan. And actually, to get to that, the last question, we have an expert panel of other task force members to bring up to talk more deeply about what's happening in Iraq and the region. So thank you very much to both of you. And let me invite the rest of our panel to switch out. And while we're switching out, I'll go ahead with introductions.